morning. Jim Schofield. I've come to talk to you about this wonderful aeroplane, the Miles Hawk Speed 6. Forgive me from referring to my notes. There's some numbers in here I want to get right, and I know what you lot are like. You'll pick me up if I get them wrong. So from 1932, Miles Aircraft were building some amazingly efficient aircraft for the age. They were turning out wooden touring, club and racing aircraft and doing an amazing job of it. The first aircraft they built in any real numbers was the 1933 Miles M2 Hawk. They built 55 of them. They sold them for £395 each, which in today's money is worth about £28,000. The Miles M2 Hawk, if you think of a de Havilland Moth but with the top wing removed and a thicker cantilever monoplane bottom wing, that's what that looked like. And unusual for its time, being a monoplane, it meant you didn't have to rig it like you had to with biplanes. They built a number of one-off variants of the M2 Hawk, including single-seat races, cabin tourers with 3 seats in tandem, which must have been fun, and a long-range single-seater as well. But in 1934, there was a shortage of Cirrus engines, so they moved over to the Gypsy Major, and they called that aircraft the M2 Hawk Major, which came out in 1934, and they built 64 of them. The Hawk Major looks like a Magister, but with this more swept tail fin at the back. It had a 130 horsepower Gypsy Major engine with a metal engine mount, and the aircraft sold very well to private owners, including 2 that were fitted with smoke generators to enable them to do skywriting, which hasn't really been seen since because of some propaganda law that you might have heard is being overturned as we speak, hopefully. But Miles at the time were building some racing aircraft that were really competitive, which was unusual for such a small family company. The prototype Miles Hawk went on to win 2nd place, and this 2nd place will come up a few more times in the next few minutes, in the 1934 King's Cup Air Race at an average speed of 147 miles per hour. And in 1934, Squadron Leader Malcolm McGregor flew a Hawk Major from RAF Mildenhall to Melbourne in Australia in 7 days and 15 hours in the McRobertson Air Race, and we'll see a tribute to that later today. Moving on then to the Miles Hawk Speed 6, first flew in 1934, and the main difference between the Hawk Major and the Speed 6 was this had a Gypsy 6 engine, 200 horsepower, and they spent a lot of time trying to streamline it as well as possible. So if you look at the wheels on this, they're very tightly trousered. Miles, out of interest, he could have built a design with retractable undercarriage, which could have kept it lower drag, but he decided to save weight and just keep those gear legs aerodynamic through the use of trousers or fairings. And despite this, it was a fearsome racing machine and quite the machine to have at the time, but they only built 3 of them. And these were built very much to order by the rich folk of the time. The first one was Alpha Charlie Tango Echo, ACTE, the prototype. The second was this aircraft, Alpha Delta Golf Papa, which I'll call Golf Papa for the rest of this talk. And the third was Delta Oscar Delta, ADOD, which was commissioned by a lady called Ruth Fontes in 1935, and she kept that aircraft at Reading Aerodrome in Woodley, which is where Miles were based. And that was the only Speed 6 to be fitted with a Gypsy 6R racing engine, which was designed for the Comet Racer. That aircraft, DOD, was sold to Flying Officer Arthur Clouston and Fred Tasker, and in 1936 they entered the aircraft into the Schlesinger Air Race from Portsmouth to Johannesburg. They made it nearly all the way there before it had engine problems, and they had to force land the aircraft. Clouston was fine, but the aircraft was totaled. It was matchsticks. So they left the wreck where it was and they brought the engine back because the engine was so rare. Which brings us then onto this aircraft, the only survivor, Golf Papa. I need to tell you a little bit about a man called Louis Fontes, though, brother of Ruth, who owned the other Speed 6. So there was a Brazilian shipping magnate who owned, he was an incredibly wealthy chap, but he died quite young. So his son, Louis Fontes, in 1933, at the age of 21, inherited his dad's entire fortune. What did he spend it on? Racing cars, fast aeroplanes, and hell-raising. So he started racing that year in 1933. He got his pilot's license a year later in 1934. and he bought this aircraft, a bespoke racing design with very few hours to his name, in 1934. We'll get back to the flying, but in 35 he started his first and last full season of motor racing. And I'm aware there are some motor racing guys around here. It's not my field. I'll try and keep it to what I believe to be true. So instead of working his way up through the various racing series, he went straight for the International Trophy race, which involved 100 laps of Brooklands in front of 20,000 people for prize money of £1,500, which in today's money is over £100,000 worth. So he was a racing unknown, driving a tricky 2-season-old 2.3 litre Alfa Romeo. He stood no chance of success. The 38 drivers, including Fontes and a young chap called Richard Shuttleworth, started racing, and with 30 laps to go, it was Fontes and Shuttleworth who were vying for the lead position. And Fontes amazingly went on to win the race and all the money. Shuttleworth finished in 5th, and Fontes had averaged 88 miles an hour over those 100 laps. A succession of high-profile driving victories that year led to him being invited to drive in Le Mans, would you believe, in a Works Lagonda, 4.5 litre Lagonda, alongside a chap called John Hindmarsh, who was a Hawker test pilot. And they ended up winning Le Mans that year. So this chap, Louis Fontes, was on quite a roll. Back to the flying. He also achieved second place in the 1935 Grosvenor Challenge Cup at Leicester at an average speed of 171 miles per hour in this aircraft, and he won, see, money isn't in aviation, he won £20 for that one, about £1,500 worth today. 2 months later he took part in his first King's Cup air race, a 1,000-mile air race around Britain, but a pipe came loose which led to an oil leak, and he had to force land the aircraft, and he took the undercarriage off and bent the propeller, so that was out of action for a little bit. After that accident, a month later, he was carrying out an illegal road race and crashed, killing a motorcyclist. His defense when he was arrested and sent to court was that he was very, very drunk. Unsurprisingly, he was sent to prison for 3 years, penal servitude, and then on release he had a driving ban for a 10-year period thereafter. So he stuck to air racing after that. While he was in prison, others flew Golf Papa, and the last time all 3 Speed 6s flew together was in the 1936 King's Cup air race. This aircraft has been modified over the years, and it's now back in its 1938 configuration. But in 1937 they shortened the gear legs, and it had, if you look at the Magister wing, it's got a straight inboard section, and then what you would recognise here as these wings outboard of that centre section. So in 1937 they moved the undercarriage outboard of that centre section, and then in 1938 they got rid of the centre section entirely, moved the wings in, reducing the wingspan from 36 feet to 28 feet, all in the name of speed. But she took second place again, in the King's Cup air race in 1937, with an average speed of 184 miles an hour, so that speed's creeping up all the time, flown by the flamboyant Flight Lieutenant Tommy Rhoads. After Fontes was released from prison in 1938, he gained a new aviator's certificate, still being banned from driving. He resumed flying. He came 13th in that year's King's Cup, again in this aircraft. He put Golf Papa up for sale in 1939 for £850, worth about £55,000 today, with only 150 hours on the airplane's name. But no one wanted to buy it. So just prior to World War II, I think he could see the war coming and wanted it to, keep it safe for when he came back from war. So he kept it in a garage in London, and amazingly, most private aircraft, particularly fast ones like this, were requisitioned by the Air Ministry for military use. But this escaped that, and it lived out its war in this garage in London. Louis Fontes joined the Air Transport Auxiliary in 1939. Unfortunately, he was killed only 2 months after Richard Shuttleworth was killed. Louis was delivering a Wellington to RAF Landau near St Athan, had an engine failure on approach, and the aircraft crashed. After the war, the aircraft was bought back by Miles. They used it for a bit. Then when they went bust, it was bought by a chap called Ronald Payne, who raced it for many, many years. And he kept streamlining it and making the aircraft faster and faster. And Ronald Payne was the guy who founded Derby Airways, who went on to become British Midland, and then BMI, and have just been bought out by BA. No matter how much Ronald Payne's raced this aircraft, he never seemed to beat the handicappers though. He could never do better than second. But he posted the fastest time in the King's Cup Air Race on 5 occasions, which meant that he kept the SBAC trophy in perpetuity after that. In 1971, the oil pipe came adrift again, had another fire, and they rebuilt it with, I don't know if you Google pictures of this aeroplane, the most common pictures you'll see are in a cream colour with what I can only describe as a horrific bubble canopy that really doesn't suit the aeroplane at all. But it was very fast, and he got it up to 194 miles an hour. When this was rebuilt in 1971, Ronald Payne then went on to race it in the 1972 King's Cup, getting it up to 195 miles an hour, which is pretty nippy when you think back to its original speed of 150 or so. Between 1986 and 1989, it was restored back into this condition, which is a 1937 canopy, but with the 1938 wings a little bit shortened, and I think it's definitely the configuration to go for. In 1999, a chap called Roger Mills, a BA Concorde pilot, bought the airplane, and it remained with him until this year when Shuttleworth bought it. And having spent so much of its life at Old Warden, it's great to see it back here now. 2 interesting facts about the airplane. The original engine is still fitted, and it still holds the FIA 100-kilometre closed circuit speed record at 192 miles per hour. So that's the history of the airplane. What's it like to fly it? Well, one of the reasons it was such a good racer, with that Gypsy engine, it's got a really tall but narrow cross-section, which means it's quite aerodynamic. So when you're sitting in the airplane, and it's quite with this original canopy, it's quite a squeeze to get in. So I have to get into it like this, and then bring my arms down in front of me, and then I can expand my shoulders up again. And then my head's the only bit that's sitting where the canopy is. So you feel like you're wearing it. But I can get in it, and at 6'4", you know, that's not too bad. There are airplanes I can't get into, this isn't one of them. So with that narrow engine in front of you, you've got quite a good field of view. It's got brakes, which is novel for a 1930s aeroplane, so that helps with the steering. It's got a tail skid at the back. It spent a lot of its time with a tail wheel at the back. The tail skid is better on grass because it's a bit more drag and it keeps you straight. But the tail wheel was put on, as I understand it, when it was living at Fair Oak, so it could operate from the hard runway there. It's got 2 controls, a primer and a tickler. So the Chipmunk, that's thankfully done by the ground crew, and the pilot then doesn't have to get that wrong. But in this aircraft, that's left up to you. One potential gotcha, though, is because the exhaust sits so close to the grass, by the time the fuel has come out the bottom of the cowling, which is standard for a Gypsy, you then need to move the aeroplane, because the exhaust is so close to this puddle of fuel, you could easily set fire to it, which would obviously be a bad thing for an all-wooden aeroplane. So you prime it, you then move it if there's much fuel that's come out. You put the brakes on. It's got an electric start, unusually. It normally starts first time. And the Gypsy 6 sounds wonderful. Lots of cracking and farting at idle, and you know, it sounds wonderful at full power. So easy enough to taxi on the ground. You don't use any flap for takeoff. And then full power, very, very controllable during the takeoff roll. It'll climb at about 1,500 feet per minute, and at a cruising power setting of about 2,100 RPM, you'll easily get about 140 knots out of it. It seems to me that with your head in the right place, the 2 arguably most important instruments, which are the oil pressure and the oil temperature, are hidden under this crash padding here. So you really need to look down to see those. So that would be a criticism of the design of the cockpit, but otherwise it's very nicely laid out. The only other potential gotcha is that the flap limiting speed is quite low, so you're typically doing 55 knots on the approach, and the flap limiting speed with full flap is 65 knots. So when that flaps down, you need to be very careful, particularly in the overshoot, if you do have to throw the landing away and go around, that you don't exceed the flap limiting speed. The landing itself is very easy. Having come from a Magister, and typically aircraft are a compromise of stability and control, the Magister was a training aircraft, so that prioritizes stability over control. You want your students to be nice and safe, but it really rolls slowly. And when you're flying a Magister in formation, that's a bit of a hindrance, if I'm honest. Having come from a Magister and then having flown this aircraft, this is a delight. Very nice in roll. You need to keep your feet active to keep it going straight, with a relatively small tail fin at the back, but that's fairly typical of the era. So a delight to fly.
Does this behave like a fighter then?
It handles, yeah, I mean, comparable handling, I would say, something like a Chipmunk, but then a Chipmunk doesn't fly too dissimilarly to a Spitfire. You know, very nice harmony. So just a lovely airplane to be in. It won't keep up with a Mughal. It won't keep up with a Comet. In fact, flying this with the Comet the other day, the Comet was as slow as he could go, and I was as fast as I could go in this. But then the Comet's got, you know, over twice the power. So a delightful airplane. Great to see it back with the collection, and a very interesting history. So thanks for sticking with me. Anyone got any questions? Well, in which case, thank you very much, and enjoy the show.
Thank you.